My name is Adam Ward. I'm Director of Studies of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And in tandem with my colleagues on the stage and in the audience, I'd like to welcome you all to this event with the theme Cold Wars, Hot Wars. This is part of an initiative here at the Institute that we are assigning the rubric of geopolitics for business. And that in turn expresses our ambition and hope to engage particularly the corporate sector in a more systematic and in a more vigorous way than we have up until now in some respects. Of course, we've got many motives for doing so. The Institute has for many years had an extensive network of corporate members working in different sectors, working in different parts of the world. We've benefited from the support of a number of corporations who've really been, for us, what we consider to be research partners investigating some of the key questions that we feel need to be examined around the world. And of course the Institute also has an offshoot called IISS Consulting, where we often provide tailored bespoke analysis to some of our corporate partners, where we try to perform a service that we've come to conceive of as geopolitical due diligence. We haven't got that trademarked yet, but that's at least the ambition. So that is the wider framework in which we are very keen to ensure that the work that we do reaches the corporate network in as immediate, effective, and usable a manner as possible. We want to make sure that the work that we're doing all the time across the Institute and its various offices is as relevant to the corporate sector as possible, and the perspectives that people in the corporate sector have to adopt. And we have also a slightly less altruistic motive, which is to make sure that we at the Institute as analysts have access to the great store and fund of technical knowledge, of regional knowledge, of on-the-ground knowledge that people in the corporate sector have. And Nigel, you're in the second session. Some people's enthusiasm for engagement is higher than others. What can I say? Slight intelligence failure there. But, anyway, so we want to engage you, we want to get access to your knowledge, we want to benefit from the insights that you can share with us. And I think some of that ambition is reflected in the initiatives we've taken in the last few years to launch some new research programs at the Institute. For instance, one on geoeconomics and strategy, where we're looking at the intersection between global economic forces and geopolitical developments and trying to find out what the direction of travel is, which is influencing the other, and in what manner. We also have a program on security and development, which looks at the new hybrid, very complicated forms of insecurity that are affecting the developing world. The insecurities that sometimes can arise out of a process of development, for instance, in the case of urban insecurities, and the degree to which some forms of insecurity are hampering and hindering the objective of development. And the Institute has also in the last few years established an energy security program as well. But why are we here today in particular? Some of you may have gathered that earlier this morning we had a press launch to mark the 2015 edition of Strategic Survey, which is the IISS review of world affairs. And that is really a stock-taking and we hope a sense-making exercise that involves, in fact, many of the people on the stage with me and in the audience who are going to be addressing you later today. And the objective we set ourselves there is to assess where do we see change, where do we see continuity in the world, and what is the effect of change and what is the effect of continuity. Now, inevitably, today's seminar requires an act of intellectual compression. We want to look very widely at the global geopolitical situation, and in doing so it seemed to us that the rubric of Cold Wars, Hot Wars was appropriate. It was accommodating of many of the phenomena and the features of the contemporary global scene to which we want to draw attention. And of course Cold Wars and Hot Wars are not to be thought of as phenomena that somehow stand isolated in juxtaposition or in some hermetically sealed way distant to each other, but they're happening simultaneously. They are intermingling in many ways, and they draw attention to the complexity of the modern world with the interaction of state and non-state actors. Now, in respect to the first session, on Cold Wars themselves, of course it's not our ambition to persuade you that we can point to regional mini variations and replicas, simulacra, if you like, of the Cold War as classically understood in the East-West sense. What we do want to do, however, is to demonstrate that in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe and Eurasia, we are seeing or witnessing the development of forms of interstate antagonism that do bear, albeit to varying degrees, albeit in some cases more at the level of latency, some of the hallmarks of the characteristics of Cold Wars. And I'm talking about here really about a measure of ideological conflict and competition, theology in terms of competing political values, in terms of competing nationalisms. We're talking about geopolitical rivalries, including from states thought to be either revisionary or revanchist or revivalist. We are talking about the creation and the defense of spheres of influence, or strategic perimeters, if you like, around the world. We're talking about military modernization, often of a very vigorous kind, that's intended to create freedom of action and maneuver for certain states and other organizations, and also to deter the freedom of action of others. We're seeing alliance building, and we're seeing alliances being tested and challenged. We're seeing active conflicts, we're seeing latent conflicts, and frozen conflicts. We're seeing the use of proxies by, if you like, the central metropolitan powers to exert influence on their peripheries. We're seeing the imposition of sanctions to achieve geopolitical outcomes or to provide a form of containment. We're seeing the repeal of sanctions to achieve similar kinds of geopolitical outcomes. We're seeing economic and financial outreach among third parties by the big powers to generate loyalties or sympathies, or at any rate a sense of deference among the periphery to the interests of the center and the key protagonists who are involved in these geopolitical disputes. Now in Asia, of course, one legacy of the Cold War continues to live on in the division of the Korean Peninsula, which has, of course, region-wide significance. But the dynamics we're looking at here are really the ones that are driven by China's emergence, by its dissatisfaction on a number of levels with regional dispensations and arrangements and alliances that it sees as restricting and cramping, and above all, the expression of its own, or a product of its own former strategic lassitude and geopolitical weakness. And the other element of this driver in Asia is, of course, the concern of some of China's neighbors about the ambiguity over the long term of Chinese intentions and their consequent precautionary desire to form political military relationships and to possess military capabilities that provide them with a measure of protection or leverage, or that raise the risks to China of asserting itself in ways of which they would disapprove. Now, regional dynamics are, of course, fluid and adaptive. There's lots of cooperation going on there. There's certainly a great deal of economic exchange. But there is arguably enough also by way of territorial disputes, nationalist sentiments, military modernizations, to plausibly create the conditions for some sort of a strategic calamity which would result potentially in the bifurcation of the region into competing camps, that is to say, camps that are avowedly contending and competing as opposed to merely implicitly doing so. In the Middle East, of course, a kind of Cold War has been going on between the United States and Iran since 1979. Although the wider ramifications of the recent nuclear deal in terms of Iranian behavior modification, as it were, on other fronts, has yet to be proved, there are optimists who see in that nuclear agreement at least a possibility and a hope of that eventuating, and in any case that a war, or the potentiality for war between the US and Iran, has been significantly retarded by this agreement, at least for the foreseeable future. But it's also clear that this more positive viewpoint is not the one that you will find most prominently voiced in Tel Aviv or in a number of Arab capitals in the membership of the Gulf Cooperation Council, where there is skepticism about the sincerity of Iranian commitments, where there is anxiety about the degree to which the lifting of sanctions will result in Iran's economy burgeoning and allowing Iran to acquire resources and capabilities with which it can exert influence, and in which its normalization, or its quasi-normalization in respect of its relationships with the outside world, raises the cost of imposing punitive and punishing measures on Iran should it not, in fact, come into full compliance with the commitments that it has made under the nuclear agreement. Now, the region of the Middle East, of course, is one that is festooned with forms of competition and antagonism, and that state competition, particularly possibly between Iran and Saudi Arabia, is, of course, a very prominent feature in the ongoing conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, where states are being ripped apart, borders are being shattered and frayed, and groups like ISIS are springing into being in order to try and establish a new kind of regional order. In the case of Europe, the vestiges of the classical Cold War have been, to some extent, as we know, reanimated as Russia has moved to draw a portion of a former Soviet state back into its own borders with the annexation of Crimea. In Europe, of course, also NATO has been revived and galvanized in the face of such Russian actions, and there is growing strategic concern among a number of frontline states, not quite from the Baltic to the Adriatic, but pretty close, about the position that they now find themselves. And the wider strategic ripples of this phenomena are also being felt as Russia seeks, or is required to seek, a closer strategic alignment with China, and sees itself compelled to assert its interest in the Middle East in respect of Syria in a very vigorous way. And this is just one instance, at least, in which the three regions that we'll be examining in the first session, their geopolitics are linked to each other, or at any rate are contextual to each other. Now, of course, the US is still the preponderant security provider in each of these regions, and its attempts, as with the much-touted pivot to Asia, to try to establish some sort of strategic order of precedence or priority between these various regions has proved highly challenging and complicated, and the whole process, as we know, has been captive to these interlinking complexities between them, as well as to the force and the flow of incidents and events. In the second session, which is going to be focusing on the character of conflict and the exercise of power, what we're trying to do there, what we will try to do, is to talk about new forms of capability, the extent to which traditional defense thinking and geopolitical thinking is being challenged by their emergence, and how economic considerations need to be brought much more closely into the geopolitical calculus. We'll examine cyber, its diffusion among states and non-state actors, the way it needs to be considered also in connection with more traditional manifestations of conflict internationally, and how it may connect or need to be connected to notions of deterrence that also require continual re-examination in the nuclear field, about which we will also hear. Now, with all of these premises of traditional military and geopolitical doctrine and statecraft being challenged, it's of course a very taxing challenge for defense planners who are faced with hybrid forms of conflict, ambiguous threats, and sources of conflict with which they're unfamiliar, to really adopt the kind of prudent and astute judgment in respect of where they should invest, in what capabilities, to achieve what kind of balance of resources, and over what sort of time span. And that's an issue that we'll look at as well. Now, whether, I should say rather, whatever they decide in terms of the military planners, that'll have very little bearing on how the strategic landscape as a whole is being shaped around them by the exercise of economic forces, whether in respect of the instrumentalization of energy and other scarce resources for geopolitical ends, whether it's in terms of the challenges posed to the coherence of the global monetary order or trading system by the rise of new centers of geopolitical power, or whether it's by the supply of new forms of economic institutions by rising, or to some extent arrived powers that are intended to reflect the shifting balance of economic capability and geopolitical ambition. China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is the most famous example of this, and of course it is intended to serve the objective of the One Belt, One Road project, and to that extent is perceived by many to have a clear geopolitical ambition. People point out that belts tend to have a buckle, and that roads have a starting point and a premeditated destination. Now, at the end of today, what we want to do in the final session is to bring the conversation back to the business perspective. We'll try to answer the question of so what? So what in respect of everything that we'll be discussing in the first two sessions for business, and how people in business need to think about these challenges. And to that end, we'll be joined later on, I can't see him here yet, we'll be joined later on by Sir Sherrod Cooper-Coles, a distinguished former British ambassador who has lately had very senior appointments at Rolls-Royce and currently with HSBC. So that is essentially what we want to achieve today. I should stress that what we want is for this to be as much of a dialogue as possible. Everybody who is formally due to speak has been given very strict instructions to confine their remarks to 8 minutes, which I hope will leave plenty of time for people from the floor to ask questions, to challenge what they've heard, or to force us to interpret what it might mean for all of you. So I will now turn over to my colleagues. We're going to hear from Tim Huxley, who runs our Asia office in Singapore. We'll hear from Sam Charap, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia. He's based in our Washington, D.C. office. Emil Hokayem, who is our Middle East expert, based predominantly in the Kingdom of Bahrain, where we have an office. And Dana Allen, an American living in London, who is editor of Survival and also Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy and Transatlantic Affairs. So, Tim, can I turn it over to you?
Thanks very much, Adam. So I'm going to talk about great power rivalry in the Asia-Pacific region. I should start off by saying that there's presently certainly no new Cold War in the Asia-Pacific, though perhaps the ingredients are present for quite a serious confrontation to develop in the coming years, or even in the coming months. Having said that, even now, rivalry and competition among the major powers in the region, or with important interests there, is all too apparent. In its most obvious dimension, major power competition in the Asia-Pacific involves efforts by China to undermine the role of the United States as the primary power providing security in the Western Pacific, while simultaneously asserting its own, in other words, Beijing's national interests around its maritime littoral. Manifestations of China's strategy in the region include, firstly, the development of so-called anti-access area denial military capabilities by the People's Liberation Army, which are already complicating the military equation, military calculations for the United States in the region. And secondly, over the last several years, China has made efforts to strongly reinforce its territorial claims in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. In the South China Sea, these efforts have included rapid land reclamation and construction on the features that China occupies, and in the East China Sea, China has declared an air defense identification zone and is widely expected to impose something similar in the South China Sea in the near to medium term. And thirdly, China is attempting to create a regional political environment which is more sympathetic, or at least more accommodating, with regards to its strategic objectives. It's been doing this by exploiting its economic leverage, particularly in relation to smaller and weak states in Southeast Asia, and also by encouraging disunity amongst members of the regional association ASEAN. For its part, the United States, which has been militarily preponderant in the region since the 1940s, has, since 2012, responded to the challenge from China through what it calls its rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, sometimes referred to as the pivot. This has included significant economic and diplomatic elements, as well as a military dimension involving the deployment of additional forces such as littoral combat ships to Singapore, and the strengthening of alliances and security partnerships with many regional states. The United States has expressed serious concern over what China's been doing around its maritime littoral, particularly in the South China Sea, and has objected to the East China Sea Air Defence Identification Zone and the South China Sea construction activities. At the same time, though, the United States has clearly not wished its relationship with China to deteriorate into a Cold War. The two countries are deeply interconnected economically, and China is needed as a partner on many issues, both in the Asia-Pacific region and further afield. It's also unclear that the United States has the resources to manage a Cold War in Asia while it's still heavily committed in the Middle East and to European security. So Washington has endeavoured to keep channels of communication open, particularly between its own and China's armed forces, with a view to avoiding or, if necessary, managing accidental escalation. In talking to senior American officers from Pacific Command, it's clear that avoidance of conflict is as important a priority for them as is the assertion of American interests. China and the US are not the only major powers involved in Asia-Pacific security, even if they are clearly the two most important. However, the roles of India, Japan, and Russia are all underdeveloped, and each of these three powers faces obstacles in playing a more important role. Largely in response to China's strategic rise, Japan, under Shinzo Abe's leadership, has been thoroughly revising its security posture to one that is more assertive, though within the broader context of an increasingly close security relationship with the US. Except in the event of a radical change in the regional security role of the US, resulting from a loss of national will or lack of resources, or both, Japan is going to remain a secondary power. The protracted difficulties in rebooting Japan's economy underline the limits on Japan's regional role. Having said that, within the existing constraints, Japan is playing a more important regional security role, not only in terms of strengthening its alliance with the US, but also its closer defence links with Australia, India, and some Southeast Asian states. Despite its interest in further strengthening economic relations with China, India is clearly concerned about what it sees as the growing strategic challenge from Asia's other major power, including through the Chinese Navy's expanding operations in the Indian Ocean and China's cultivation of relations with smaller Indian Ocean and South Asian states. But New Delhi has remained strategically rather diffident in its relations with the countries to its east, with Southeast Asia. The door is open to India playing a more important role, but the substance that might be expected from an India which acts east as well as looks east has not yet quite materialized. And finally, Russia's role in the Asia-Pacific security realm is characterized by uncertainty, the absence of policy emphasis and prioritization. Moscow seems unclear about whether its currently warming relations with China should represent the beginning of long-term strategic cooperation or a more tactical short-term arrangement. At the same time, Russia is strongly preoccupied, of course, with its western and southern borders and apparently lacks the capacity to focus on the Asia-Pacific to the same extent at the same time. So in conclusion, great power rivalry is increasingly evident in the Asia-Pacific, particularly between China and the US. Japan is closely aligned with the US still and is likely to remain so. India and Russia are hedging, but power relations in the region are highly complex and particularly that's the case because of the economic interdependence between China and other powers in the region. The wild card is a potential major crisis in the region, perhaps over the South China Sea or maybe over Taiwan, which could cause the lines of confrontation to become much more clear-cut. If that happened, the ramifications would be economic as well as strategic and would be highly disruptive, not only in the Asia-Pacific but more widely. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Tim. Wild card, arguably, in some senses, in Europe and Eurasia has been played, and the dividing lines are much clearer. So that's set Sam up very nicely.
So, first point I'd like to make is in terms of framing. The crisis that began in February 2014 has multiple levels, 3 of them. The first is domestic, in this case social and political cleavages within Ukraine, but more broadly the social and divisions and political cleavages within a number of Russia's neighbors, that is the non-NATO EU neighbors, the so-called Eastern Partnership countries, that is Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Many of these have organic roots, but are often exacerbated by Russian involvement. The second is the regional level, Europe here, but most acutely Eastern Europe. And then the third level is the global level, and here we're talking about the broader Russia-West, or really Russia-US conflict or tensions that have emerged. And all 3 of these levels are closely interrelated, but each requires what you might call bespoke efforts to address. And this complexity is what makes why I think it will be so difficult, and why it's even hard for me to describe what might be a path, barring some sort of positive black swan event, to ending this crisis in a sustainable way anytime soon. And very easy for me to see how the current trajectory, which I'll call the New Cold War as a shorthand, is likely to continue. So I'm going to briefly discuss 3 consequences of, I think, this most likely scenario, and then end on some thoughts about why I think it's the most likely outcome of this current crisis. But just to emphasize, New Cold War is a shorthand. The sequel, so to speak, will be very different from the original. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Putinism might be a catchy moniker for the Russian system, but it is not a universalist ideology with global revolutionary ambitions. Of course, that is by no means a reason to believe that it will be any less dangerous. So 3 consequences of the current trajectory playing itself out over time on each of those 3 levels of conflict. The first consequence, if this new Cold War dynamic continues, is that Ukraine, as we know it today, would be finished. Although we've seen a decline in violence over the last couple of weeks, the conflict in Ukraine's east is far from over, and at any point, given Moscow's evident discontent so far with the outcome of the Minsk II process, it could take actions to change the current dynamic on the ground. The only question really is the form in which those actions, I mean the use of force, will take and the extent of the damage to Ukraine. But Ukraine's economy is already in tatters. In 2014, industrial production shrank by 1/5, GDP contracted by nearly 1/10, and the currency lost half of its value, and inflation skyrocketed by 25%. This year, again, the World Bank predicts over 7.5% of GDP contraction, and inflation is currently at 40% on an annualized basis. So, particularly if the conflict in the East drags on, this will only get worse. Before the conflict, the Donbass accounted for 16% of Ukraine's GDP, a quarter of its industrial output, and 27% of its exports. So, to put it briefly, a new Cold War would transform Ukraine into a violent, perennially destabilized economic basket case. Second, this scenario, the new Cold War, would destabilize Europe well beyond Ukraine. During the last uptick in tension between Russia and the West, from mid-2007 to early 2009, Europe experienced a cyber war in Estonia, a real war in Georgia, and a gas war in Ukraine. This time around, Russia has allegedly financed fringe parties in the EU and that threatened to undo the European integration project, allegedly abducted an Estonian intelligence officer along the border, and pushed brinkmanship in the skies to dangerous new levels with these close encounters between Russian air patrols and Western jets, both civilian and military. And because of these tensions, this new dynamic on the continent will become a drain on U.S. military and diplomatic resources. The Obama administration has already spent $1 billion on its European reassurance initiative, and we can expect that sum to be a mere down payment on billions more in reassurance measures and further military deployments to come. Indeed, an additional $789 million were requested for fiscal year 2016. And the new tensions on the continent will divert resources and attention from priorities in other regions, particularly the Asia-Pacific, at a time when sequestration has already forced significant belt tightening at the Pentagon. The third consequence is that as the prospect of a settlement of the regional and domestic levels fades completely and that new Cold War dynamic sets in, the gloves on global issues will come off in Moscow. Russia will seek to outright spoil Western efforts to address global challenges, and we should be prepared for them to achieve some success in that context. I think the recent intervention in Syria is a case in point, but so too is the Russian withdrawal from the U.S.-led nuclear security summit process. And in the future, we could expect developments like real active Russian collusion with China on Asia-Pacific regional security matters, vetoes of all Western initiatives at the UN Security Council and the international financial institutions, and so on. One thing that is often forgotten about the so-called U.S.-led international order that was created after the Second World War is that it really only began to function in earnest once the Cold War ended, and a new Cold War would reverse that progress. So in conclusion, why these multiple levels of conflict make it so hard to avoid a new Cold War? The relationship between the levels is, I think, the answer. So it's clear that negative developments on one level have negative consequences on other levels. So the Ukraine crisis began at the domestic level with the Maidan Revolution and the subsequent dramatic deepening of existing social cleavages in Ukraine. Quickly it rose to the regional level with Russia's intervention, and then the West's response escalated it to the global level. So that negative spillover, I think, is clear. The problem is that there is unlikely to be such automaticity to potential positive developments on one level. So for example, let's assume that Minsk II, the current peace plan for eastern Ukraine, is implemented fully. It is at best a partial regional level solution. If there are developments in other neighboring states, for example, say if Lukashenko in Belarus falls, conflict involving Russia is probable. Still, there will be no reconciliation as a result of Minsk to address the significant social tensions inside Ukraine, the domestic level. And the global level of the conflict might be mitigated somewhat by partial sanctions relief, but the broader new Cold War dynamic between Russia and the West will not be undone. So this lack of positive reinforcement between the levels of conflict suggests that it is unlikely that the relevant parties could effectively manage the tensions of this new Cold War at a low threshold, let alone bring relations to a new normal. Doing the former, that is, managing, would require a sort of Minsk II process for all three levels. And while the latter would entail sort of, a Helsinki process for all three levels. And the politics of the moment make that kind of grand diplomacy and reconciliation almost completely unimaginable. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all. What I'm going to do in the next 8 minutes is look at one very important aspect of the current instability in the Middle East, but by no means the only aspect of the current instability. So it's important to keep this in perspective. I'm going to look at how the Iranian-Saudi competition is unfolding and what it means for the broader region. What is unfolding is a very complex and multidimensional competition that is taking place in many arenas across the region. It is, in essence, a geopolitical struggle for dominance about who is going to be the dominant player, not only in the Gulf region, but more broadly. Of course, one needs to keep in mind the fact that countries like Turkey, Egypt are also powers in the region, but Saudi Arabia and Iran make particular claims in terms of Islamic leadership and regional leadership in the region. And they are the main drivers and the main actors of a number of those conflicts in the region. The self-image as champions of their own strain, their own brand of Islam, is not something to take lightly. We tend to dismiss, we tend to think that the sectarian dimension of those conflicts, we tend to think that religion is somehow merely an instrument. But those states have an identity, and they project power largely by embracing that role that gives them and allows them to pose as even bigger actors than they would be. Now, when one looks at the Gulf region, one notices immediately that there are huge imbalances in that region, geographic, demographic, economic, in terms of global integration, and military, obviously. And here, just on paper, Iran has many advantages. Large population, talented, its geographical position is key in that regard. But Iran, in a way, since 1979, has made a set of decisions that have isolated it globally and regionally. I think it's worth remembering that in 1979, Iran's GDP was twice that of Turkey. Today, Iran's GDP is half that of Turkey, and Iran has oil and gas. And just to put things in perspective, in comparison, Saudi Arabia's GDP has increased massively because of oil, but not only. Also a large petrochemical investment. So Iran, is relatively weaker than it could be under a different set of circumstances, and if Iran makes a different set of decisions for its own national development. So this competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia is unfolding in weak states and fractured societies for a number of reasons. I think the first one, an important one, is to understand that the security of the Gulf region is seen by many actors as an international, as a global public good. Many countries are invested in keeping that region stable because of trade, commerce, energy flows, etc. And the gain is fundamentally contained by the fact that the U.S. is the dominant actor in the Gulf, and the U.S. does not want to see interstate war. And the U.S. is a key actor in terms of managing regional escalation of violence and is the prime security provider. It's also the case because the Gulf states, relative to other states, Arab states, are stronger and relatively more stable. It is more difficult for Iran to use the rifts that exist in other Arab societies and in the Gulf states. It doesn't mean that it's not happening. It is happening. But it doesn't have the same level of potency. And Iran itself is always struggling to define to what extent it really wants to compete with Saudi Arabia. And same thing with Saudi Arabia. There is no desire in both places for a direct confrontation. So essentially, they're fighting it out elsewhere, in Iraq, in the Levant, in Yemen to some extent. The thinking in Riyadh and Tehran is that fighting or competing elsewhere comes at lower indirect and delay costs. And that actually victories, for instance, in Syria may well deliver Lebanon, which is another arena. Or victory in Syria also delivers Palestine. There's a lot of inferences and a lot of calculations around. And it also has to do, the reason why the competition is unfolding in fractured states is because Iran itself is aware of its own limitations and weaknesses and has developed asymmetric strategies of power projection. it basically is excellent at developing and nurturing allies and proxies across the region. And what are these arenas? Well, already mentioned, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and now Yemen. Now, in that competition, Iran has real advantages, and we see it. It has expertise, experience, and strategic patience. One cheeky way of looking at it is to look at, a key actor of Iran's, regional policy, General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards. Qasem Soleimani in the 80s was a foot soldier and an officer fighting the Iran-Iraq War. In the 90s, took part in counter-terrorist, counter-narcotics operations, was involved in Afghanistan, and in the previous decades is one of the men who frustrated the US and the UK most in Iraq. And he now leads operations in Iraq and Syria. Quite a formidable person, whether one agrees or not, that's different, but he's a real soldier. He sleeps on cold floors and eats the bad food that soldiers do, and shows up on the battlefield. This is the capability that Iran has developed for a very long time, and it's one that it deploys over long periods of time. Iran does real investments. So the most formidable ally of Iran today is Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is which is a central element of Iran's deterrence and punishment capability against Israel, if there ever was an escalation on this front. So this is the capability that Iran has developed over the years. The Gulf states in general, and Saudi Arabia in particular, are much younger states. They don't have mature national security bureaucracies. They've been risk-averse for a very long time. They were focused on survival, on regime security, and they've been reliant on external allies a lot for their own security and the achievement of their regional objectives. So there is a fundamental difference here, both in terms of capability, in terms of competence, in terms of staying power. Now, if one were to look at the current competition, it's important to understand that for a country like that, both Saudi Arabia and Iran have heightened anxiety about this competition. They do generally see it as, in a way, existential. That competition may, either significantly increase or affect their regional standing. And this, of course, is exacerbated by their own reading and perception of international developments. We can discuss later the effect of the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal, on how Iran sees itself in the region, and it's the margin, or how Saudi Arabia, sees the Iran deal and how it affects its own calculations. What is unmistakable is that the Gulf states, and in particular Saudi Arabia, have been a lot more assertive and active in their own neighborhood in recent times, in some part because they think, and I think for good reason, that the US is no longer willing to do their bidding. So they have to take ownership of the regional agenda. Whether they can do it or not is a different matter. So how is this playing out? And I'll end on this, specifically in the three key arenas today. In Iraq, I would argue that the Gulf states are a marginal player, and that's a decision of their own since 2003. The Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia in particular, have in a way counted on the United States while it occupied Iraq as the balancer, as the power that would keep Iraqi politics in line and prevent the rise of Iran. And Iraq and the Gulf states haven't really invested positively or negatively in the development and future of Iraq, and I think they don't have much leverage here. I would argue that Iran is the dominant external power in Iraq since 2011, 2012. Iran is struggling at times. This is a huge responsibility, and we see Iran invested today in the fight against ISIS. But I don't see a direct Gulf challenge there. In Syria, the story is fundamentally different. There is intense competition. There is direct Iranian intervention in Syria. There is indirect Gulf intervention in Syria. And the positions are quite clear. Iran is committed to Assad's survival. And I think it understands that without Assad, there is no regime in Syria. There's a bunch of warlords that would be very difficult to orchestrate in defense of Iranian interests. So the Iranians are deeply invested, while Saudi Arabia is totally committed to Assad's removal. So those two positions basically influence their respective conduct of war and their respective conduct of diplomacy. And finally, Yemen, where we have indirect Iranian intervention and direct Gulf intervention. I would argue that the Iranian support of the Houthis has been significant, but it hasn't been decisive. But the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia in particular have seen this as a potential or actually an actual threat to the security of the peninsula and are acting upon it. But the reality is that if you win in Yemen, you just win in terms of your immediate security, but it doesn't have ripple effects regionally. Whereas Syria is a place where if you win, and I don't think there is a victory to be had, it's purely for the sake of the argument here, but if you do it, there's Lebanon, there's Palestine, there's the future of the Levant within reach. So that competition is bloody. It has many shapes, and I think it's unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. So on that optimistic note, Dana?
Thanks very much, Dana. So we've had three pretty graphic descriptions of very sizable items in the U.S. in tray. What's it going to do?
Right, well, that's what I wanted to talk about in 8 minutes, which is to try to assess the level of American engagement or disengagement from these three Cold Wars that we've been talking about. And to start with, I think we've already had a little bit of a discussion or a little bit of a rumble about whether Cold Wars are the right ways of thinking about these things. I don't see why not. I mean, my definition is not very complicated. The classic Cold War was a long-term strategic and ideological struggle with aspects of major war, but without direct fighting between the major antagonists. And in these terms, to state the obvious, the Cold War was a very positive thing. It was a major positive accomplishment because the United States and the Soviet Union never went to war. John Gaddis even wrote a book about it, calling it The Long Peace, and by his title, I think he meant it was a pretty good thing. But I would add one positive and one negative element to that assessment. My positive remark is to challenge the conventional view that the long peace was mainly a consequence of nuclear weapons. Obviously, we will never know. It's counterfactual. I would observe, however, or I would suggest that in the two places where the United States and the Soviet Union came closest to fighting each other, in Cuba and in Berlin, there is a good case to be made that in the absence of nuclear weapons, they would still have avoided war. I don't have time to defend that argument here, which is obviously counterfactual anyway, but I'd be happy to do so later or over coffee, drinks. The negative remark is that if it was a long peace, that was only the case in Europe and in North America, if you weren't a draft-age black man sent to Vietnam. For the rest of the world, including, of course, Vietnam itself, it was an age of brutal and sometimes genocidal proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this is a crucially important point that I want to come back to. So with this historical experience in mind, how do our three posited Cold Wars look to the United States? I'm going to go through them briefly in descending order of importance, by which I mean importance to the United States. And it's interesting to me that it's the same order that this panel was set up in. I don't know if that was conscious or not. But what it implies, if I'm suggesting a priority of Cold Wars, is that for the United States, these are Cold Wars of choice. Engagement or disengagement is an option, at least to some extent. Asia Pacific is by far the most important one. China is the only country with the economic potential to be the peer competitor of the United States. In fact, it could be argued that China is the only country in modern history with that potential. So that, includes the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and so forth. Another way of saying this is that China is the only country that could, in the foreseeable future, fight a major war with the United States. And the consequences would be catastrophic, even if it remained below the nuclear threshold. China and the United States are also the two indispensable countries for international diplomacy to avert catastrophic climate change, which I would rank as the top, as arguably the top, and certainly one of the top 2 or 3 threats to human security for the period after our lifetimes. The Obama administration's, Adam mentioned the Obama concept of a pivot or rebalance to Asia. And I would describe that as a kind of, its content is not so clear, but it was a kind of strategic branding exercise meant to emphasize the importance of this region. That exercise was in certain ways arguably botched, but I think it reflects a real American priority. Second, Europe, Russia, and Ukraine. Now this contains a paradox or an anomaly. Why am I ranking it second? Now and for the foreseeable future, America's most important allies and partners are European. The economic center of gravity may be moving east, but our partners are going to remain European in important ways. Europe's successes after World War II and after the Cold War were the most significant successes of American international policy. Europe itself had quite a bit to do with it, but America deserves credit too. And Europe's failure, a sort of systemic failure in Europe, would undo much of what has been accomplished, and I couldn't see scenarios where it would threaten American security. Why then, from an American perspective, do I rank this Cold War only in second place? The answer is very simple. Because it is a struggle that is being contested on Russia's borders. This doesn't mean it's unimportant to the U.S. or that there are no important principles at stake or that the fight over Ukraine couldn't contain seeds of a larger disorder in Europe, but the fact remains, for the present and foreseeable future, Russia's stake in that fight is much greater than America's. Just compare it to the classic Cold War, when the military front line was the inner German border, and the ideological front lines were in Germany, Italy, France, and at times even Britain. Maybe coming back to Britain, but never mind. Russia in Ukraine has been nasty and aggressive, but in strategic terms, it is on the defensive. There's a corollary, however, which is that on its own borders, it has much greater leverage and resources. Its interests cannot be ignored. I think that my colleague Sam Shepard would probably agree with that. In fact, I chaired a meeting last fall in Washington where Sam spoke, and one of the members of the audience was Ambassador Richard Burt, a former Reagan official who also happened to be a fellow at this institute editing the journal I edit quite a few years ago. But Ambassador Burt made the following point. There are serious limits to what the U.S. can do about Ukraine, just as there would be serious limits to what Russia could do if a similar conflict occurred on the Rio Grande. And Russia tried to insert a civil war in Mexico, and Russia tried to insert itself into that civil war. So I think we have to bear that in mind in terms of the limits of what can be done. The Middle East is, and here I'll say something hugely controversial, possibly counterintuitive. The Middle East is least important from America's point of view, but it's also the engagement that's been most controversial, most tragic, most exhausting, and it's obviously been the place of most American effort, military and diplomatic effort over the past 15 years. I think I'm out of time, but let me put down 3 markers, and I hope we can return to them in the discussion. First, when I say it's least important, we can obviously debate that in terms of, in terms of terrorism, America's relations with Israel, its relations with Arab allies, energy, and of course the humanitarian catastrophe that's been unfolding, especially in Syria. But when I say it's least important, I think what I'm trying to drive at is that the choice of relative disengagement is seen to, from Washington's point of view, to be a disengagement from other people's Cold Wars. And this is why I'm very glad the way Emil framed what's going on. There is a Cold War, a central Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I would not suggest that America has no stake in that, but it's not as great as the stake in the struggles in Europe or Asia. Second, over the past, at least the Obama administration, Washington has viewed the most important threat in the region to be Iran's possession of nuclear weapons, which was conceived as a game changer. This has been its priority, and it appears to have succeeded in preventing it, at least for 15 or more years. So I guess I just say disengaging from a particular Cold War is not the same thing as disengaging from the region. Third, none of this says anything about America's responsibility for the trauma and the tragedy of the humanitarian catastrophe, especially in Syria. Something that America has not prevented, and there's a lot of criticism of Washington's failure here. I think maybe we want to come back to this, but let me just say to conclude, from Washington's perspective, the prospect of engaging in a proxy war with Iran in Syria, which it's doing to a certain extent, but only a very limited extent, has some historical resonance. Here is a partial list of the proxy wars that the United States engaged in during the classic Cold War: Korea, Congo, Vietnam, Cambodia, Angola, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Afghanistan. That's an interesting list. Some of those wars made strategic and arguably moral sense for the United States to engage in. But in how many of them was America's decision to fight or even to give support to the local fighters a benefit for the local population?
Lena, thank you very much indeed for keeping to time. We do have about 30 minutes in which we invite you to make comments or to ask questions, to challenge if necessary the things that you've heard. If you do want to make an intervention, raise your hand. Microphone will make its way to you. And if you could identify yourself for the benefit of everybody else. First person, Cho Kong, right at the back from Shell. This way, keep your hand up.
Thank you, Cho Kong from Shell. A question I pick up from the speakers. So, U.S. relatively disengaged on Syria, Russia committed to Assad, Cold War confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the end result is washing up on the right at the door of the EU. What does the EU do about this? Does the EU change its mind on a policy of relative disengagement, non-involvement, low-key foreign policy in the countries bordering the EU? This is a more general question than Syria.
You invite Nigel to answer that question. Nigel gave a brilliant answer to that this morning.
Nigel, do you care to answer that question?
Syria.
Yes, please.
Thanks very much. Yes, so Nigel Inkster, Director of Transnational Threats here. I think that what's happening with Syrian refugees at the moment in Europe is testing very substantially the European project and identifying some very clear vulnerabilities in that project. If one takes the numbers that have come, are coming, are likely to come from Syria to Europe, if this was something that was dealt with centrally by Europe through agreed allocations to be accepted by all the states and with refugees being processed centrally, etc., this would not actually be that difficult or probably, arguably, that burdensome for Europe to absorb. And indeed, the case has been made with some justification that some of the countries to whom these refugees are heading are growing quite rapidly and could use another injection of youthful talent. And in parentheses, it's worth saying that most of the Syrian refugees that are heading to Europe are middle class, aspirational, well educated, exactly the sort of people that these European countries might actually want to have. They haven't moved straight from Syria. They've come from the refugee camps in surrounding states, places like Lebanon, Turkey, hoping that their sojourn there would not be too long. They'd be able to return to their country and rebuild. They've now given up. They've effectively abandoned their country, and what we're seeing now is a massive brain drain, the long-term implications of which are quite serious. And I think what we're facing now, this is a real challenge for Europe, and I've got a horrible feeling that Europe's going to flunk this test. We haven't yet. We can't say with certainty that the mandatory quota system proposed by the EU Commission will be rejected, but there are known to be a lot of countries with serious reservations about accepting this, and of course we're in one country that's has an opt-out from this arrangement and will clearly choose to exercise it. So I think what we're going to probably end up with is a rather messy set of arrangements which involve greater funding for neighbouring states to facilitate better standards of accommodation in refugee camps, acceptance of refugees to varying degrees by varying countries, border controls that have been quite legitimately imposed under Schengen on a temporary basis, possibly becoming more long-term, and in that case calling into question one of the very fundamental ideas that kind of underpin the European project. So I think this is going to be very messy and probably not something that Europe comes out of well.
Thank you. Yes, Graham Boyce.
Graham Boyce. It's more in the way of a comment really on Iran and Saudi Arabia, where you used a kind of shorthand of being a Sunni-Shia conflict. I think it's a bit more asymmetric than that. In many ways you could look at it as a Persian-Arab, at least seen from the northern part of the Gulf. And also, because from the Iranian point of view, the people who they've supported, apart from Hezbollah, have not been pure Shia, if you like. You've had Alawites, you've had Houthis who don't really conform in that way. And I think there's also another important thing, and that is that Saudi Arabia does not represent the whole of the Sunni Ummah. And you could argue that there is a potential other Cold War going on, which is for the heart of Sunni Islam, between the Wahhabi tendency and the large majority of the Sunni community, which is yet to be fought out, certainly in the ideological space, quite apart from on the ground in places like Iraq.
Do you want to make a brief reply to that?
Sure, and this is why I started my presentation by saying this is an important but not the dominant feature of current instability. I agree on this. On the other aspects, fair, but I would actually qualify this a bit further. I would say that Iran's most reliable and organic allies tend to be Shia proxies, the hardest. I mean, there's no doubt that Iran would like to have more allies. I mean, it has, supported and sponsored Hamas in the past, the Palestinian offshoot of the Brotherhood. It hasn't gone that well. They're doubling down on Shia militias now in Iraq, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. And just as there is a struggle for, the hearts and minds of Sunni Islam, you also have the same one in Iran over Shia Islam. I mean, Iran is disputed as a leader. I mean, of Shia Islam, largely by the Hawza and Najaf. I mean, Sistani and others. But these are the two dominant actors. They're the ones who deploy sectarianism, for power projection. And we can go around that fact. It's unfortunate. It's not perfect on their part, but it is a dominant feature of the current struggle.
Thank you. Gentleman here in the front row.
Hugh Boddington. If the USA were to reverse its priorities, would it make a difference?
By reverse its priorities, re-engage in the Middle East with the forcefulness of, let's say, the George W. Bush administration. I think I've just answered the question by rephrasing it. That did make a difference. I don't think that anybody in Washington, even on the neoconservative right, would have the stomach to try to resurrect that project. I also think it's important to recognize that it was an anomaly. The United States has been an important, obviously, strategically, the most important player in the Middle East, but it's exercised its power by indirection for most of the second half of the 20th century. And until the invasion of Iraq. When I set up this rank of priorities, I wasn't suggesting a disengagement, but I was suggesting, or a complete disengagement, but I was suggesting that a choice for how hard to go in the Syrian civil war, for example, is constrained by this calculation of other priorities as I laid them out.
Let me put the question to you in this way. To what extent do you accept the argument that America's pivot to Asia is something that has to run through the Middle East? In other words, that America's standing in Asia, its credibility, its status, its ability to influence, depends on it not being a regional power, but on being a global power, and therefore having a particularly strong role to play in the Middle East, which for economic and energy reasons is absolutely central to the vitality and the economic stability of the Asia Pacific. And if the pivot to Asia isn't simply about the continuation of a military presence, but is conceived in these economic terms, does that not require, much as though the Americans might regret it, America continuing its role as the key provider of security and seeing a linkage between those two? And to that extent, Europe drops down the order of priorities and must take greater care for itself.
When you phrase it that way, I wouldn't quarrel. But I think you have to make a distinction between maintaining how did you put it, maintaining a strategic presence and fighting wars. And I think one thing we have to recognize that every intervention has an opportunity cost. I'm really struck, I'm working, as you know, on a book on the subject of the Middle East. And I noted that on the eve of the Six-Day War, Lyndon Johnson was trying to get a lot of support, especially from American Jews who were disproportionately anti-Vietnam War. And one of the arguments that he was making to Israeli politicians to try to gin up more support was to say that our credibility vis-a-vis Israel depends on our credibility in Vietnam. In other words, if we are seen to abandon many more millions of Vietnamese, how can we be trusted to protect only a few million Israelis. This was a perfectly plausible argument. On the eve of the Six-Day War, there was an idea of mounting an American-led NATO flotilla to try to reopen the Strait of Tehran. And it was impossible. And the main reason it was impossible was because of what was called at the time Tonkinitis, the fact that the United States Congress was absolutely opposed to getting involved in another naval exercise, which was seen as possibly leading to another Vietnam. So I would say that America's involvement in Vietnam precluded doing something at that time rather than making it more credible.
The gentleman right at the back here, Mr. Ward.
Thank you. Jim Evans, member of the Institute. Could I ask Tim to comment on how much India's problem with Pakistan has limited its ability to develop as a strategic power, and how much that might limit its ability to do so in future?
Well, it's a good question. I'd say that it's a large part of India's continuing orientation, strategic orientation to the West, which detracts from its capacity to fulfill the demands of looking east and acting east. And Look East was first enunciated in the early 1990s, a generation ago, and Modi has, within the last couple of years, talked about not just looking east but acting east. But clearly, Pakistan is an important distraction, but it's not the only distraction to the West, because of course there's also a broader Indian strategic interest in the Gulf and in Afghanistan and in the Western Indian Ocean that form part of its overall strategic outlook there. Now, clearly, in India's strategic interest in focusing on Pakistan is not going to go away quickly. I think the question is whether India can develop the strategic capacity to continue looking west and to look east at the same time. And I think we're beginning to see that a bit more. And for example, in the Indian Navy, it's clear that they have an idea of what India could be doing to the east, but sometimes have the sense that there isn't a broader strategic policy framework for India to act east. That sometimes the Navy seems to be taking the initiative with its patrols into the Malacca Straits and even into the South China Sea and port calls in Vietnam and exercises with Australia. But it really needs a much more serious policy framework for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tobias Wolf at Ministry of Defence. I'd just like to ask the panel sort of a combined question. Do you believe that the EU is sufficiently cohesive to have its own Cold Wars, or is it just an adjunct to the US? And if the former, in relation to what you said, sir, about the US priorities, does the EU have its priorities regarding the relevant Cold Wars facing it in the right order?
Jana?
I'll just say one thing, which is that what Nigel described plays into this, and sort of an answer to the first question from Co about potential for increased EU activism in its neighborhood. What we're seeing today in terms of the divisions within the EU does not bode well for a coherent, strategic, and well-coordinated policy at the EU level in anywhere, its neighborhood included. And I'm thinking, as far as foreign policy priorities go, about the growing divisions between South and East within the EU, and how that might play out on the, competing crises, so to speak, of migration / the broader South versus the East.
Just two things. One is that the earlier question about refugees, does indicate something perhaps at odds with my presentation. Obviously, when you have a wave of refugees such as this, you ask yourself whether this has risen to the level of a strategic threat. I mean, and strategic in the sense of really systemically affecting Europe's cohesion and its ability to keep its act together. I thought that's why I was so eager for Nigel to answer it, because I'd heard him make this case earlier today about, in terms of sheer numbers, although it's quite large, it should be digestible. But I think the further point is that, Europe's crises are interlocking and multiple and systemic, and they, at root, I think they're driven by the economic crisis. I think you can make a very persuasive argument that the euro, which at the time thought was a great idea, was a strategic level error. But I think that's also, Europe is to a certain extent a victim of its own success. The potential divisions that Sam spoke about are divisions that come from a larger, expanded Europe. And this expansion has had a lot of positive effects, particularly in terms of stabilizing and developing some East European countries. Although when you look at the behavior of Hungary right now, you wonder exactly how successful it's been.
And just one thing, though, and if you look beyond the institutions in the current crisis, the U.S. at least the U.S. president, is very happy to defer to European leaders on taking the lead on diplomacy. So I don't think that we can totally write off Europe as a diplomatic actor in this context, even if the institutions themselves are not the main actors. I'm thinking specifically of the Normandy format, where, of course, the United States is not present, but and it's very clearly Chancellor Merkel driving that train.
Can I ask a question? Was it problematic from your American point of view that Minsk was Merkel and Hollande, and with a very small American role?
Or non-existent, as the case may be. I don't have a problem with it, but a lot of people inside the Beltway certainly did. And there was a sense that the U.S. should have been at the table among many, and that was a critique of the administration's policy. But I think the current U.S.-German coordination on this score is actually quite good, and both at the very highest levels and below.
Thank you. You in the front here, yes, please.
I just want to pick up on
Just
your...
wait for the microphone to reach you.
They train us to talk loudly. It's interesting to pick up your point about the concept of a global public good, and it links to what you were saying about if the global security institutions didn't function brilliantly in the Cold War until those pressures were removed and thus allowed them to function a bit better. So now we're looking at multiple Cold Wars with the threats to the rules-based international order that generates, whether it's civil airliners being shot down, international maritime boundary disputes and not being arbitrated through IISS, UNCLOS tribunals, or whether it's cross-border or threats to nation-states from transnational actors. At the same time, you've outlined the fact that US unwillingness to engage quite so forcefully in an arena where it was the external security provider, at the same time that other institutions in the EU said, well, they're not very they're not lining themselves up to act as well. So who props up the rules-based international order if we now seem to be reluctant for external actors to do it because regional players want to have their say? Do we go, where do you see it heading? Regional security alliances again, or are we really going back to fully multipolar, no one's doing it, regional hegemony?
Who wants to tackle that? Emil?
No, Dana first.
No, I just want to make a comment, and hopefully somebody else can answer it more fully, about sometimes we have the assumption in these discussions that there was this halcyon era of rules-based international order underwritten by the United States, by U.S. power, and now things are falling apart. Well, things are falling apart to a certain extent, but I just want to remind you of that list that I read out. Korea, Congo, Vietnam, Cambodia, Angola, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Afghanistan. I mean, this was an era where this supposed global order was an era of mass killing. And, right now we have a truly horrific war in Syria, and I don't want to relativize it in any way, but it's not as though this is something that's unfamiliar. You referred to airlines being shot down. A major Cold War episode I remember was the Soviets shooting down a Korean airline. I think that there was a kind of high watermark of expectation and hope. You could see immediately after the Cold War, and in fact, after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the UN Security Council, which had been sort of paralyzed throughout the Cold War by U.S.-Soviet division, suddenly stood up out of its wheelchair and started to act. So that was a moment of considerable hope. But it was short-lived. And one reason it may have been short-lived is we tended to assume the triumph of sort of universal values and rules-based ways of doing things without taking sufficient account of the residual national interests held by countries like Russia that they were going to defend.
I think you make an interesting and important point. Of course, European institutions are very elaborate, but there are questions about how effective they are. They grew up under a security umbrella provided by the United States. And that brings me to the point that if you're going to have significant growth in institutions, you do need some sort of common sense of a settled distribution of power, common acceptance of legitimacy and authority in which that can take place. And it doesn't take much inspection of Asia and the Middle East to recognize that those are the ingredients that are most lacking in those parts of the world. And so in Asia, there are elements of a regional security architecture, but there's nothing very concrete. Nobody wants to commit themselves to a binary choice one way or the other, and there's a preference for, among the smaller powers, a degree of ambiguity. There's an inability on the part of the major powers to impose their exclusive preferences, and the geopolitics of the region are being conducted in the interstices of those two positions, which are replicated also in the Middle East. So if these things are not likely to spring up in those really primary strategic theaters of Asia and the Middle East because the regional dispensation does not allow it, it's hard to see how there can be any kind of building blocks for a more adaptive, modernized, global set of institutions, which instead look as if they're facing a period of calcification and gradual erosion. Not a cheery point. Tim, do you want to come back?
Yeah, just a brief comment from the perspective of the Asia Pacific. It was clearly a crucial question. It is very apparent in the Asia Pacific that some sort of multipolar order is evolving. As it's clear that American relative power is in decline, that China's relative power is increasing, and perhaps the relative power of some other players is increasing. And I think both the Chinese and the Americans are grappling with this, and it's sometimes explicit in what they say. And the Americans are talking about trying to develop what they call, in their language, a regional security community, in which, and that seems to effectively involve trying to integrate or socialize China into a more or less American or Western way of doing things, and to be a cooperative actor that will play by the rules of the game. But on their part, the Chinese are pushing the idea of sharing responsibility with the US and going for a sort of shared regional hegemony. In other words, tempting the Americans into effectively preempting China's rise and buying into an acknowledgement of China's rise by sharing power in the region now. And there are quite a few takers in the Asia Pacific for that idea. Even in Australia, this is part of a very live debate now. But of course, amongst some of the smaller and medium powers in the region, that's not necessarily an attractive proposition, because it suggests that they could be cut out. There could be a deal between China and the US that could effectively utterly compromise their interests. But it is a matter of very lively debate in the region now.
I just want to make a point about this in the context of global institutional and the potential for global institutional cooperation that is often, I think, lost about Russia, which is that despite its tiny, minuscule percentage of global GDP, shrinking population, you could go through the list of all these, this portrait of Russia as the, rotting power or whatever. It plays and will continue to play a disproportionately important diplomatic and political military role internationally. It just simply has, I would argue, when it comes to diplomacy and even just power projection beyond its immediate region, besides the United States, it is the second most capable in that regard, and has, even if you just down to personnel within foreign ministries, the quantity of people working on, say, international security issues, you're not going to find an equivalent even in Beijing. And that gets me to, I think, the problem with the regional Cold Wars and the global order, which is that we haven't acknowledged that there are trade-offs, right, in the context of countries that are systemically important for international institutions like Russia, that we can, either pursue, that we can't at once pursue the current policy that we are pursuing in Ukraine and expect the UN Security Council to function. As a case in point. And so far, we have not been willing to contemplate that such trade-offs do exist. But that's what's playing itself out right now. And I think that dynamic will only, intensify as time goes on.
Thank you. We've got 3 interventions. We'll take them all at once if we may, and they're all in the same sort of vicinity. Why don't we start with the gentleman in the second row, and then behind you, I think you have Escar, and then somebody up against the window there.
Hello, Chris Ashcroft from the Security Association of the Maritime Industry. A very short question. In the post-Cold War era, do we think that the whole idea of the United Nations and the 5 vetoes has any real place at all, or is the UN becoming increasingly irrelevant?
Thank you. And then, behind you. Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. Geir Westgard, Statoil. I was wondering if I could ask the panelists to reflect a little bit on the interlinkages between these 3 regional Cold Wars and some of the key players. And just for example, how does the Cold War in Europe affect Russia's pivot to Asia, so-called? How does the Cold War in the Middle East affect Chinese thinking about its energy security longer term? And could you see, for example, the Cold War in the Middle East affecting Western calculations as to the pros and cons of intervention in the region again?
Thank you. Then just behind you.
Thank you. Jonathan Wood from Control Risks. Perhaps in the same vein, I'd like to ask the panel, or perhaps anyone else, what they think about the economic factor in these Cold War dynamics, and specifically the oil price, if you like, variable. We have two scenarios, one very low or perhaps potentially prolonged period of low oil prices, one higher oil prices, but it would be hard to deny that this has been a key factor in the shaping and perhaps stability of these Cold War dynamics for the last 12 to 24 months.
Thank you. It's an important point, but I will reserve it for the next session. So Nick Redman is on notice to make a note of that question and provide an elegant and succinct answer to it. What I think we'll do is I'll ask Dana to briefly reply on the issue of UN Security Council, the veto, and then by way of wrapping this session up, in order to keep time, I'll ask Emil, Tim, and Sam, each in turn to say something about how their regions are affected by the other two Cold Wars outside of their own immediate vicinity. Starting with you, Emil, please.
Sure. The Middle East is complex enough, the way it is, but somehow you will find a bunch of us in the region who kind of track escalation in our region to what's happening elsewhere. Whether that's legitimate or not, whether that's founded or not is different. So Sam and I yesterday were discussing, and I'm not asserting it as something that is true, I'm just talking about the speculation that somehow Russia's venture in Syria is linked to calculations that relate to Ukraine. It's possible or not, Sam will tell you. But at least from my perspective, I mean, these are things that we constantly see. Because when you look at the Iran deal, when you look at the crisis and the paralysis of the UN Security Council over Syria, etc., you can't help but saying that they are in a way hostages to global, geopolitical calculations. Is Russia's power play in Syria linked in any way to its calculations vis-à-vis the US and Europe? You can't dissociate those conversations among top officials. So it's always on someone's mind. Now, another interesting linkage, and I'm sure Dana will have something to say about this, is when the whole fiasco over the red line over chemical weapons in Syria happened in 2013, a number of Asian thinkers, strategists, and others had questions about the U.S. and potential security guarantees. I think that was in the heat of the moment. It was a specific context, etc. I don't think it necessarily has repercussions on what's happening in Asia, but certainly that was an element of doubt and uncertainty. I mean, this was, after all, a red line, articulated by the President of the United States himself. So there are connections. And finally, in terms of security, energy flows, and you're right to mention this, Asia is the prime recipient of Middle Eastern oil. And the security of the Gulf is a global public good, but it's one that's underwritten by the U.S. at this point. I mean, it's money from U.S. taxpayers that is helping to, facilitate maritime security. If you have, a development of tensions in those various theaters, can we expect, greater power projection? Perhaps, but the flaring up of those crises will require the attention and the resources of those various states in their own regions rather than deployed elsewhere. So, I mean, I see a lot of uncertainty. I think the linkages are not that clear and they're not direct. But hey, we are Middle Easterners. We like to believe in big conspiracies and linkages, etc. So,
thanks, Tim.
Yes. Well, very briefly, two points occur to me in terms of the linkage between what's happening. 2 points occur to me in terms of the linkage between the quasi-Cold Wars in the other regions and Asia. In the case of Europe and Asia, Russia's quasi-alliance with China is seen very warily by some Asia-Pacific countries. Not all. Some have kept quite close relations with Russia, including India and Vietnam, probably Indonesia and Malaysia. But some countries, Japan, Australia, Singapore, look really askance at the closer relations that are apparent between Russia and China, and that's brought new tensions in their relations with Russia, and it's effectively helped to alienate Russia from those countries. The Middle East, there's a really major concern in certain Asia-Pacific countries, particularly Malaysia and Indonesia, which are majority Muslim countries, and also in Australia and Singapore over the potential threat from the Islamic State, and especially from fighters who've gone from those countries to the Middle East, and their possible return, and the direct threat that may pose within their societies.
So in terms of interlinkages, clearly, as Tim mentioned, the closer relationship between Russia and China is, I think, the key one in terms of the Europe-Eurasia crisis impact on the Asia-Pacific, mostly because, of course, options that Russia previously had in the West are now closed, and so often it has no other choice as a result of the Cold War, so to speak, in Europe and Eurasia. The second point, and Tim hinted at this, I think, is that Japan and Russia, for a number of political and other reasons, were probably as close as they have been since the end of the Second World War to resolving their territorial dispute and coming to a peace treaty before this crisis began, and in part as a result of Japan's membership in the G7, there was a strong push to get Japan to sign on to the sanctions, some degree of sanctions, which it did, and I think that effectively put an end to the prospects for sealing that deal anytime soon, despite the Prime Minister's continuing efforts in that regard. As far as the Middle East is concerned, I do not buy the conspiracy theories about the distraction, that he's doing, Putin's intervening in Syria somehow so as to it's like a head fake. Ooh, look over here. But that having been said, it is important to note that the context of the increased tensions between Russia and the West, I think, are one of the reasons why diplomacy has failed, because there is a dramatic lack of trust that has only deepened, of course, since February 2014, that makes highly sensitive, and potentially politically fraught negotiations like the global ones about Syria almost impossible. I mean, in May 2012, they were able to all agree on the same words, but since then, even that degree of unity, which those words didn't end up meaning very much in practice, that degree of unity has been hard to maintain. But finally, on to put that differently, if Russia believed that there was a way that they could negotiate in good faith, they had a good faith negotiating partner, which I think they don't, in the United States on issues related to Syria, I think they might be behaving differently. However, circumstances being what they are. Economic warfare of the new Cold War in Europe and Eurasia is by definition a global phenomenon, given that the economy itself is global. So, just two examples. Sanctions, of course. I mentioned the Japan connection, but if you think about the banking, given the continuing role of the U.S. financial system, banks across the world, including in Asia and the Middle East, were, of course, very interested in learning about the new restrictions and what it meant for their business. But just as far as Russians moving their own money as a result of the new era that we've entered into, there were in 2014 forced interventions by several Asian central banks, including I believe Singapore, but I'm for sure Hong Kong, and dollar-pegged currencies in the region suddenly were aflush with cash that had been moved out of perceived riskier currencies by very large either Russian entities or individuals. So those connections are clearly go beyond the region itself.
Thank you. Because we want to end this session on an upbeat note, Dana on UN Security Council reform.
Yeah, I'll be upbeat on that. I mean, I don't. Look, it's hard to defend in the year 2015 a system assigning a veto to the 5 winners of World War II, of which only 3 were actually the winners of World War II. It was a completely arbitrary process that had a lot to do with what was going on in Franklin Roosevelt's mind in terms of, his concept of 4 policemen. He certainly didn't want to see France as part of that group, but he had an utterly unrealistic view at the time of what China was capable of. Now, in the meantime, China has grown to be one of those powers, legitimately. So it's hard to defend. It's arbitrary. On the other hand, if you tried to, first of all, it's self-unreformable, since no one wants to give up its own power. Secondly, you could design a system that brought in more permanent members of the Security Council in a way that would represent better the global distribution of people and power. And that might be more just in a sort of abstract sense. It certainly wouldn't be more efficient. I mean, it certainly wouldn't work any better as far as I can see, unless somebody can explain to me how it would work better. And finally, since Adam asked me to end on a happy note, this structure of international governance, I mean, this isn't directly, well, it is directly related to the Security Council, to the permanent members of the Security Council, has just produced a document in the nuclear deal with Iran where Russia, for reasons that are almost unbelievably altruistic to me, has voluntarily given up its veto. In other words, I'm talking about the snapback of sanctions. I mean, that's a somewhat Baroque way of saying that it's given up its veto, and it's not quite true. But one of the signatories to this agreement can raise a concern about Iranian cheating, and unless the Security Council as a whole says otherwise, the sanctions go back into effect. That's an astonishing forthcoming sort of self-abnegation in a way for the purposes of a regime of global governance. So it's not all hopeless.